What up, my Captain Picards? It's Dev from The Place, and today we're looking at more Theros spoilers on a brand new microphone. I hope that's some crisp, clean audio quality for you there, my friends. But anyway, let's go ahead and start at the bottom, or at least what I believe is the bottom, of these 4 new Theros cards today with the Binding of the Titans. The B of the T is 2 mana, 1 and a green for an enchantment. This is a saga, and it's uncommon. In Chapter 1, which remember occurs as soon as you play the card and it hits the table, each player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. In Chapter 2, exile up to 2 target cards from graveyards. For each creature card exiled this way, you gain a life. And in Chapter 3, return target creature or land card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, I put this one first, basically the bottom, because I do think that every card we've seen so far has a little bit more potential, but I think that I'm ready for us all to kind of be wrong about this one. I think there's various ways we're misjudging this card, and I don't think it's amazing or anything, but I do think that all 3 modes are usable. Let me say that, and 2 mana is not really too much to ask for this. And I really actually like the 3rd chapter, the Raise Dead chapter on this, because it kind of constricts the way your opponent can play. This is an anti-sweeper piece of tech in a way, because you'll be able to get a creature back after you get Deafening Clarioned or something. You get hit by Ritual of Soot, Realm Cloak Giant, whatever. You might be able to get a creature right back to your hand. But even if your opponent just has spot removal, then they kind of have to play around this card as soon as you play it. You play the new Enchantress on turn 3. You play this on turn 4 if you still have your Enchantress. And then if your opponent removes your Enchantress, you can just get it right back. And you've drawn a card because you had the Enchantress out when you played Binding. So I like that. But even with stuff like, Edgewall Innkeeper, small creatures, you play Innkeeper turn 1, you play this turn 2. And that's kind of not the best line ever. But if your opponent does kill your Innkeeper, you just get it right back on Chapter 3. So I like that. But obviously, graveyard strategies will love this first thing. And it's a piece of anti-graveyard tech at the same time in Chapter 2. So I think the card does an awful lot. And even though 2 mana doesn't look like a very good rate for this, I will say that when you add up all the chapters, it does take 3 turns to get all of them, but when you add up all the chapters, it's definitely worth more than just 2 mana for this effect. Plus, again, we've got the new Enchantress in Standard. We've got Starfield Mystic to make this cost just 1 green mana. So I think there are various ways this could actually be a playable card in Standard, both in enchantment decks and in Graveyard Matters decks and whatnot. And again, I really think that the Chapter 3 is a lot better than we're giving it credit for, because a free Raise Dead on the final turn is actually really impactful. So I don't think the card is amazing or anything, but I will go ahead and give it a 6 for now. And it's definitely got room for improvement from there, especially considering what we've yet to see in this set. If there's a real Enchantments Matters deck out there, then I think this might slot into it. But moving on to what I believe is the next on the totem pole here, let's look at Allure of the Unknown. This came out this morning as I'm recording this video. This is 5 mana, 3 a black and a red, Rakdos colors for a sorcery. Reveal the top 6 cards of your library. An opponent exiles a non-land card from among them, and then you put the rest into your hand. That opponent may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Now, I've seen a lot of confusion on this. Your opponent has to cast it right then and there, or else it would say your opponent may cast the card for as long as it remains exiled, a la Thief of Sanity, for instance. But this is not worded in that way. Your opponent gets 1 shot to cast the card that they've chosen. So that makes the card a little bit better than a lot of people are judging it, because again, your opponent doesn't get the rest of the game to cast the card, and I think that's really good. Now, what deck it goes into, whole other story. This kind of looks like an Escape to the Wilds for Rakdos, but probably not as good as Escape to the Wilds, honestly. I've seen various people say maybe this goes in an aggro shell, and then people will respond to them with 5 mana cards don't go in aggro, but that's not necessarily true. Skargan Hellkite, Glorybringer has a long and storied tradition of being in red deck wins the entire time it was in Standard. And then Stormbreath Dragon, all of these are 5 mana red dragons. So they're not the best comparison or anything, but all I'm saying is 5 mana cards have been in aggro before recently too. Lyra Dawnbringer is another good example. But these are all big threats, just in the game, if they're not answered. Allure of the Unknown isn't necessarily that, and it gives your opponent an awful lot of choice. So, I don't know, but it could fit in a few things. You know, if you do want a refueling piece in aggro, this is probably at least worth thinking about as like a 1 or 2 of, because your opponent's probably just going to get like a, you know, small creature or something, you know, most of the time. But then again, they might get a removal piece or your Murderous Rider, and you don't necessarily want that. They might get a Bedevil, you know, it depends on what you're playing. Theater of Horrors, like there's all kinds of terrible stuff your opponent could get off of this. So I don't know about that. Note too, that this could be played in some sort of, you know, control deck. If you had a 4-color control deck with Teferi, this would be a great option for that, because your opponent can't actually play the card. You know, your opponent has to play the card right then and there while this card is resolving, and they can't, because Teferi's in play and they can only cast stuff when they could cast, you know, sorceries. So they cannot, literally, physically cannot cast the spell that they choose with this. So combo with Teferi, it might be nice, but that's a 4-color control deck. And I think it's possible. I don't think it's jank or anything. I think it's possible, but the lands might have to go a little bit better before that's like truly feasible. But possible, yes. But I do think the card has a lot of potential. You know, 5 cards. You get 5 cards in your hand. Now, the best one goes to your opponent. But again, it's not always the best one. It's the best one for your opponent's situation at the time, or for the game state at the time, which doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the most powerful card of the 6 every single time, right? So you know, take that into account. There's a lot of stuff here. You know, if you have enough mana up, you can cast this and then counter the spell that your opponent gets to cast. If you're holding counter spells too. So there's a lot to think about with this. And of course, if you're playing with Teferi, again, back to Teferi for a moment. If you're playing with Teferi, you can cast this on your opponent's turn if you +1 Teferi. So there's just a lot that sort of goes into the evaluation of this card. In a vacuum, it doesn't look great, but when you look at the current format, I definitely think there's pockets of viability. There's an argument for the card, but there's probably better stuff. You know, if you're playing a Teferi deck, you just play Drawn from Dreams or something. It's probably better than this. But Drawn from Dreams doesn't put 5 cards in your hand either. I also should, by the way, while I'm on the card, I should mention the always amazing Seb McKinnon. Just maybe the best artist working in the community right now. But still, I mean, I'm not ready to write the card off right now like most of the community is. So I'm going to give this one a 6.25. It can definitely do work in decks that want it, but we'll have to find decks that want it and want it enough to actually like shoehorn it in, you know, like the 4-color control deck is probably the deck that wants it the most just off the top of my head. But like, I don't know that 4-color control wants to even really be a deck. So I guess we'll see. But moving on to our Christmas present this year, on December 25th, we got Grey Merchant of Asphodel. So Gary is back. In case you've never seen Gary before, this is 5 mana, 3 and 2 black for a 2/4 zombie. And when it ETBs, each opponent loses X life, where X is your devotion to black, and then you gain that much life. And this card is crazy. This card is like one of my favorite cards from the original Theros. But if you remember, about a month ago, I put out a video talking about the 5 cards I want reprinted in Theros and the 5 cards I don't want reprinted. And this was on the list that I don't want reprinted. But like, now that I see it, I'm fine with it, I guess. You know, I tweeted out the other day that I for one, welcome our new mono black overlords. Because, you know, you could go like turn 1 mini black 1-drop. Turn 2 Yarrick's Finlurker, even though I don't necessarily think you need Finlurker for this, but we have it. Hopefully we get another 2 black thing. In Theros somewhere. But you got turn 3 Iara, turn 4 Deathless Knight, turn 5 Grey Merchant. The game's just over. It's just over. At that point, you know, you're hitting, God, just Iara, Deathless Knight, and Grey Merchant is 4, 7, 9 by itself. So if you've got like a Knight of the Ebon Legion and a Yarrick's Finlurker that have been swinging for damage, like the game is effectively almost over at that point, if not just over outright. But, you know, there's counterspells in the format. There's Hushbringer in this format. So there's definitely stuff to combat Gary, but I still think that like it might be a mistake, which was like my whole justification in the, you know, the video where I said I don't want this reprinted, is that I think it might actually seriously be a mistake right now. Like mono black is really powerful at the moment, and I think it's just waiting on a piece or two to like really put it over the edge. You know, a card like this and maybe one more really good instant speed removal piece that only costs like 2 mana, or maybe just a good black 2-drop. You know, things like that will just put this deck over the top, and I think this goes a long way towards doing that. That said, mono black is one of my favorite kind of decks to play ever. You know, I was trying to put my own sort of biases aside in that video and say maybe for the good of the game and the community at the moment, it's probably not best to print this into such a shallow format with, a very shallow card pool. It's just going to be one of the best cards, especially considering the makeup of Mono Black at the moment. I'm a little worried about this card. So again, despite my personal biases and how much I love the card, I'm a little wary that like Mono Black is going to be the best deck. Which again, I think might be cool for me, but like a bunch of other people, but not for everyone, right? If I had to grade Gary, I'll give him a 7.5. This is a very strong Magic card, but it's obviously very narrow. It only goes in like one kind of deck, and the deck almost always has to be Mono Black. Although I think you could pull off like a second small splash. I don't know that you actually have to do that whatsoever. Gary's just incredibly strong, always has been. Very, very popular card when he was in Standard, still a popular card in some other formats, and will probably be a mainstay in Standard. That said, I do think we have some good answers for him, so we'll have to wait and see if Gary takes everything over, the way we've seen in the past, but I'm a little bit wary, but I will be the first person playing with Gary. Let's move on to the last card, in this group of spoilers at least, and I think it's probably the strongest in general, and that's Klothys, or Klothys, God of Destiny. This is 3 mana, 1 a green and a red for a 4/5 legendary enchantment creature that is a god and is indestructible. As long as your devotion to red and green is less than 7, Klothys isn't a creature. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, exile target card from a graveyard. The word a graveyard there is pretty insane. If it was a land card, you add red or green. Otherwise, you gain 2 life and Klothys deals 2 damage to each opponent. That is very good. That is extremely good. It provides reach in the late game. Again, it can go to any graveyard to exile stuff, which can often kneecap opponents that are trying to do certain stuff out of their graveyard, whether it's reanimation or just, escape. That's going to be a mechanic in this format. So that's actually a really desirable passive ability that you get once a turn. Sometimes it'll ramp you, which is really, really nice. Remember that Fabled Passage is in this format, so you can ramp really, really easily with the Klothys on the table, starting on turn 4, and that ramp is really desirable. And it probably won't be too hard to get Devotion to 7, especially in this format, where we've got a lot of, especially Gruul stuff, starting on turn 1 with like Pell Collector, or really any 1-drop, but then there's Zerta Goblin and Gruul Spellbreaker. There's just a tons of ways to get your Devotion to pop off, even if you have to resort to like Ravager Worm or something. There's lots of ways to get Devotion off. Questing Beast is a couple of Devotion even, Torbrand is 3 Devotion. You can even do like Sunder Shaman or Rampart Smasher, but then you have to play Sunder Shaman and Rampart Smasher in your deck, and I'm not sure how worth it that proposition is. But either way, it's pretty easy to make this a creature, and then it can attack and block. And the 3 mana 4/5 is great. Slams into, Nissa tokens. And by the way, Nissa provides 2 Devotion for this too, for what that's worth. So I think we might see them a good bit. Hell, Embercleave provides 2 Devotion for this. So there's just so many ways to turn on Klothys in, desirable, super powerful standard cards that you were going to play anyway. So I just think that this is a really, really good card. Even if it's not a creature, it still provides a good bit of reach and a little bit of ramp on some turns. And again, will, kneecap opponents that are trying to do fun stuff out of their graveyard too. So I just love everything about the card. And even if it proves a little bit harder to turn on than I think it is, it's probably still a really good investment. And, near guaranteed damage, it's really tough to deal with. And in the late game, that really, really matters. Hell, in the mid game, that matters nowadays. Your opponent's catting you for 2 every turn. Well, you're Klothysing them for 1 every turn. You're Klothysing them for 2 every turn. So, in terms of late game and mid game inevitability, I think this is a really, really good engine that's almost always going to have a card to pick on in a graveyard or another. So I really like this. I think it's particularly strong, and it may be one of the strongest cards that we've seen so far. Again, even if you can't make it a creature right then and there, you just got your board swept or something like that, you got hit by a time wipe, and it's not going to be a creature for the foreseeable future. I still think that this kind of reach is amazing in this kind of deck, because it looks like it's going to go in aggressive and mid-range decks, and the Gruul decks needed a hit of reach like this. So I really, really enjoy what this card's bringing to the table in the next format, and it doesn't even have to be in specifically Gruul decks. This could be in 3-color decks. I just don't see it. It really requires that you hit Devotion. So all I'm saying is it could be in the Jund decks, but I highly doubt it. This looks more like a just red-green card, but Gruul is already a fairly strong deck that's just looking for 1 or 2 pieces to be the deck, and a 3-drop piece is important. We've already got Spellbreaker, but but we don't necessarily want to always play main deck Thrashing Brontodon. So I think this is a really good choice as a 2 or even 3 of main deck in these Gruul lists, and I think it's going to power them up on day one. So I'm going to give the card a 7.5, just like Gary, even though I think it's a little bit better than Gary in a vacuum. It's still a card that needs a very specific deck and a very specific game plan, and to swing with it or block with it for that matter, you have to have a pretty strict devotion to green and red fulfilled. At the same time, you could make an argument for just shoehorning this into every Gruul deck in the format for the next, year or two while it's in the format, and it's probably going to still, be a great card, regardless of whether or not you have this like insane commitment to devotion. So, big fan of this card. 7.5 is actually a really, really good score, but I'm wanting to give it an 8. But again, it's quite narrow, and it doesn't go into literally everything, and it's not a creature all the time. So there are definitely some things you have to deduct points for. But again, Gruul is looking for a piece pretty much exactly like this. So day one improvement, upgrade for the Gruul decks, and I think it's going to put them into the top tiers again. So I think that's all I have to say for this one, but there's going to be more spoilers trickling out during this week, and I believe on December 30th, real spoilers start. They're going to be dropping a bunch of spoilers every day, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the notifications so you know when I actually put videos out and whatnot, so that you can see more of these spoilers as they come out. Plus, there's going to be some gameplay here and there, even during spoiler season, because, I don't know, I'm having fun playing with bad decks right now, so I'm going to put those out for you. I might even do a final Throne of Eldraine standard tier list. Let me know if you're into that. But in any case, that's all I got for this one. So hit up the Patreon, subscribe to the channel, do all the stuff, like the video, comment on it. Let me know how you felt about these and the ratings and all that stuff. What are you excited to play out of not only these, this group of spoilers, but the set so far? I think it's shaping up to actually be a decent